was Jon Snow from the world of Game of Thrones, not defined by what he was told he was, but shaped slowly and painfully by what he feared he might be. From the very beginning, Jon's life is shaped by something he cannot see, yet cannot escape. The weight of being an outsider within his own home. He's raised in Winterfell, a place of stone and memory, where loyalty is valued above all else. Under the guardianship of Eddard Stark, Jon grows alongside true-born children who share his roof, his training, and his daily life, yet never his place. He's treated with a certain fairness, even kindness, but never equality. And children, even when loved, can feel the smallest distances more deeply than adults realize.
In his earliest years, Jon learns something subtle but powerful. Belonging is not always about where you live. It is about how others see you. Winterfell is not unkind to him, but it is never entirely his. The halls echo with history, yet none of it carries his name. The Stark children, Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, and Rickon, move through the world with inherited certainty. Their identities are defined before they even understand them. Jon, by contrast, exists in a space between identities. He is close enough to feel like family, but distant enough to never forget he is not. Among the Stark children, his closest bond forms with Robb. They train together, laugh together, and grow together. With Robb, Jon is not the bastard. He is simply a brother. And yet, even in this bond, there is an unspoken awareness. Robb is the heir.
Jon is not. His relationship with Arya is different, yet equally meaningful. Arya, who herself struggles against expectations, recognizes something familiar in Jon, a refusal to comfortably fit into imposed roles. Where others see deviation, she sees truth. Jon, in turn, offers her something he himself rarely receives: unconditional understanding. But not all relationships in Winterfell are warm. There is a presence in the castle that shapes Jon's early emotional world more than any other: Catelyn Stark. She does not mistreat him openly. She does not harm him, but her silence carries weight. Her gaze carries distance, and children, especially those seeking belonging, learn quickly how to interpret what is not said. From Catelyn, Jon learns another quiet truth. You can live among people who are good and still not feel wanted. This emotional environment does something profound to Jon's developing identity. It teaches him restraint. It teaches him observation. It teaches him to measure his words, his presence, his very existence. He becomes careful, not out of fear, but out of understanding. And yet, amidst all of this, there is one figure who anchors Jon's sense of self: Eddard Stark. Though reserved and often distant in his own way, Ned offers Jon something rare: legitimacy of spirit. He does not deny Jon. He does not hide him. He raises him under his own roof, trains him alongside his children, and gives him a place, even if that place is complicated. But even Ned carries silence. When Jon asks about his mother, the answer never comes, not fully, not clearly, only fragments. And from this silence, Jon learns one of the most defining lessons of his life. Some truths exist beyond reach.
This unresolved question, who am I, becomes the quiet center of Jon's identity. It does not drive him loudly. It does not consume him visibly, but it shapes every decision he makes. As Jon grows older, Winterfell becomes both a home and a limitation. He understands that no matter how skilled he becomes, no matter how honorable he acts, he will always carry the label of Snow. In the North, names matter, and his name reminds everyone, including himself, of what he is not. It is during these years that Jon begins to look beyond Winterfell, not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. He is not seeking glory, he is seeking place. The idea of the Night's Watch begins to take root. To others, it is a place of exile, a punishment, a forgotten brotherhood at the edge of the world. But to Jon, it represents something else entirely. A chance to become defined by choice rather than birth. At the Wall, names matter less. Background matters less. What matters is duty, skill, loyalty. For someone who has spent his entire life navigating identity imposed from the outside, this is not a burden, it is an opportunity. Before he leaves, however, Jon experiences one of the most important emotional moments of his early life, a quiet conversation, a promise. Eddard Stark tells him, "The next time we see each other, we'll talk about your mother." This moment lingers, not because of what is said, but because of what it suggests. For the first time, Jon feels that the truth of his identity may finally come within reach. But life, as Jon is slowly learning, does not always honor expectation, and truths, especially in the North, often arrive too late. As he prepares to leave Winterfell, Jon says his goodbyes. Each one carries weight, but none more than his farewell to Arya. He gives her a sword, a small, thin blade, more suited to her than any traditional weapon. He names it Needle. This gesture reveals something essential about Jon's character. He does not impose identity on others, he recognizes it. And in Arya, he sees not what she is expected to be, but what she truly is. This ability to see people clearly, beyond roles and titles, is not accidental. It is born from his own experience of being misunderstood. When Jon finally leaves Winterfell, he carries with him more than supplies and training. He carries questions. He carries silence. He carries the invisible weight of a life lived between belonging and exclusion. The journey to the Wall is not just physical, it is psychological. Each mile takes him further from the only home he has known and closer to a place defined by harsh reality. At Castle Black, Jon's expectations begin to shift. The Night's Watch is not what he imagined. It is not composed of noble warriors seeking honor. It is filled with men who have been cast aside, criminals, outcasts, men with no other place to go. For someone who has idealized this brotherhood,
The realization is disorienting, but it is also instructive. Jon begins to understand that identity is not determined by surroundings, it is determined by choices. His early interactions with the other recruits are difficult. His training has made him more skilled than most, but skill without humility creates distance, and Jon, still learning how to navigate belonging, initially struggles.
It is through the guidance of mentors like Jeor Mormont and the quiet wisdom of others that Jon begins to shift. He learns that leadership is not about proving superiority, it is about lifting others. This marks one of the first major internal transformations in Jon's life. He begins to move from isolation toward connection. He helps others train. He shares knowledge. He listens. And slowly, the same men who once saw him as distant begin to see him as one of their own. For the first time in his life, Jon begins to experience something he has always sought: earned belonging. Not given, not inherited, but built. And yet, even here, his identity continues to evolve. He is no longer just the bastard of Winterfell. He is becoming something new, something chosen, a brother of the Night's Watch. But even as he takes his vows, even as he commits himself fully to this new path, a deeper question remains, unanswered, unresolved. Who is Jon Snow? The wall rises slowly into view, not as a structure alone, but as a presence. It does not welcome, it does not warn, it simply exists, vast, ancient, indifferent. For Jon Snow, this is not merely a destination, it is a threshold. Crossing into Castle Black is not like arriving at Winterfell. There is no warmth in the stone, no inherited familiarity, no sense of belonging waiting quietly in the background. Everything here must be earned, and everything here can be lost. In his earliest days at the Wall, Jon begins to understand the difference between imagined purpose and lived reality. The Night's Watch, as he had envisioned it, was a brotherhood bound by honor, a final refuge for men who chose duty above all else.
But the truth is more complicated and more human. The recruits he trains alongside are not united by shared ideals. They are united by circumstance. Some were criminals, some were abandoned, some simply had nowhere else to go. At first, Jon struggles with this reality, not because he looks down on them in cruelty, but because he does not yet know how to see himself among them. He had come to the Wall seeking identity, but here, identity is stripped down to its simplest form. You are not your name, you are not your past, you are what you do. This realization does not arrive suddenly. It comes through friction, through small moments of misunderstanding, through conflict. Jon's skill in combat, sharpened by years of training in Winterfell, sets him apart immediately. But skill, in this environment, creates distance rather than respect.
The others see him not as one of them, but as something else, privileged, different. And in a place where difference often leads to isolation, Jon finds himself once again standing at the edge of belonging. But this time, something is different. Jon is no longer the silent observer of his own life. He begins to reflect, to adjust, to understand. Through quiet guidance, especially from figures who see beyond surface impressions, Jon starts to recognize a deeper truth. Strength is not proven by standing above others, it is proven by standing with them. This marks a turning point in his early development, not a dramatic moment, but a gradual shift. Jon begins to help the others during training, not by dominating them, but by teaching, encouraging, supporting. In doing so, he transforms something fundamental within himself.
He moves from seeking validation to creating connection, and in return, something equally important happens. The others begin to see him differently, not as the outsider, not as the boy from Winterfell, but as a brother. This is the first time Jon experiences something he has never fully known, a sense of belonging that is not conditional. It is not tied to blood. It is not granted by birth. It is built, slowly, deliberately. And because it is built, it feels real. As the days at the wall pass, Jon's understanding of the Night's Watch deepens. He learns that its strength does not lie in perfection, but in persistence. These men are flawed. They carry pasts they cannot escape, but they have chosen or been forced to stand at the edge of the world. And in that shared position, they find a kind of unity. Jon begins to internalize this idea.
That identity is not about where you start, but about what you commit to. When the time comes for him to take his vows, the moment is quiet. There is no celebration, no grandeur, only the weight of words spoken in the presence of something older than memory. Night gathers, and now my watch begins. For Jon, these words are not symbolic, they are transformative. In speaking them, he does not erase his past, but he chooses not to be defined by it. This is perhaps the most important step in his formation. Not the training, not the battles, but the decision to belong somewhere by choice. And yet, even as he embraces this new identity, the past does not fully release him. It lingers in questions unanswered, in memories unresolved. There is a quiet tension within Jon between acceptance and curiosity, between moving forward and looking back. This tension is not a weakness.
It is a foundation, because it teaches him to live with uncertainty, to act without full understanding, to lead, eventually, without complete answers. In the cold stillness beyond the wall, Jon also begins to hear stories, whispers of things older than kingdoms, older than men. At first, these are dismissed, legends told to give shape to fear. But something in Jon does not dismiss them entirely. Perhaps it is because he has already learned that not everything unseen is unreal. Growing up as someone whose identity was hidden, whose truth was obscured, Jon has developed a sensitivity to what lies beneath the surface. He listens, he observes, he does not rush to judgment. This quiet attentiveness becomes one of his defining traits. While others react, Jon considers. While others speak, Jon listens. And in a world where noise often drowns out truth, this becomes a rare strength.
His role within the Watch continues to evolve. He is given responsibilities, tasks that require trust. And with each responsibility, Jon proves something, not to others, but to himself, that he is capable of more than the identity he was given. But perhaps the most significant transformation is not external, it is internal. Jon begins to let go of the need to define himself through comparison. He is no longer measuring his worth against Robb or against the expectations of Winterfell. He is becoming something independent. This independence is not isolation, it is clarity, a quiet understanding that who he is does not need to be validated by others. And yet, despite this growth, Jon does not become hardened. He does not lose empathy. If anything, his experiences deepen it. He understands what it means to feel unseen, to feel uncertain,
to question one's place in the world. And because of this, he becomes someone others can trust, not because he is perfect, but because he understands imperfection. As the early phase of his life at the Wall settles into rhythm, Jon stands at a new beginning. He is no longer the boy of Winterfell, but he is not yet the man he will become. He exists once again in a space between, but this time the space does not feel like exclusion, it feels like possibility. The Wall, once a distant idea, is now part of him. Its cold, its silence, its endurance, and in many ways, Jon begins to resemble it. Steady, quiet, unyielding. Yet beneath that stillness, there is movement, growth. The nights at the Wall are unlike the nights of Winterfell. They are deeper, colder, more absolute.
Here, darkness does not simply fall. It settles. It lingers. And in that stillness, a man is left alone with his thoughts. For Jon Snow, these long nights become a place of quiet reflection. Not forced, not deliberate, but inevitable. In Winterfell, there had always been noise, voices in the halls, the rhythm of daily life. Even silence had felt shared. But here, silence belongs only to the one who hears it. And in that silence, Jon begins to revisit the foundations of who he is, not through memory alone, but through contrast. He begins to understand that his life in Winterfell, though marked by distance, had also been shaped by structure. There had been rules, expectations, a defined place, even if it was not the place he wanted. At the Wall, structure exists, but identity does not come pre-assigned. It must be built from within.
This difference changes how Jon sees himself. He is no longer reacting to how others define him. He is beginning to define himself through action. This shift is subtle but profound. It changes how he approaches responsibility, how he interprets duty, how he relates to those around him. Where once he observed quietly, now he engages. Where once he questioned silently, now he begins to understand without needing answers. This is the quiet maturation of his character, not marked by a single event, but by a series of small realizations. One such realization comes through his interactions with the older members of the Watch, men who have lived longer, seen more, and carry histories that are rarely spoken. From them, Jon learns something that cannot be taught directly, that duty is not always heroic. Sometimes it is repetitive, unnoticed, endless, standing watch in the cold. maintaining walls that may never be tested, following rules that seem to lead nowhere. And yet, these tasks matter, not because they are visible, but because they are necessary. This understanding reshapes Jon's idea of honor. Honor is no longer something grand, no longer something tied to recognition. It becomes something quieter, more enduring, a commitment to doing what must be done, even when no one is watching. This idea takes root in Jon's identity. It becomes part of how he sees the world, and in time, it will influence every decision he makes. Another important shift occurs in how Jon understands leadership. At first, leadership had seemed like a distant concept, something reserved for those born into it, like Rob. But at the Wall, leadership emerges differently. It is not assigned by name, it is recognized through behavior. Jon begins to notice this. He sees how certain men command respect, not through force, but through consistency, through fairness, through quiet strength. He begins to adopt these qualities, not consciously, but naturally. He listens more, speaks less, observes carefully, and when he does act, he does so with intention. This kind of leadership does not announce itself, it reveals itself over time. And though Jon may not yet see it clearly, others begin to notice. They begin to trust him, not because he demands it, but because he earns it. This trust becomes another cornerstone of his identity. It gives him a sense of place that he had never fully experienced before, not as someone tolerated, but as someone relied upon. Meanwhile, the environment beyond the Wall continues to exert its quiet influence. The vast wilderness, the unknown, the stories whispered among the men.
All of it contributes to a growing awareness within Jon that the world is larger, older, and more complex than he had imagined. In Winterfell, the world had felt contained, defined by borders, understood through tradition. But here, those boundaries feel thinner, less certain. Jon does not yet fully understand what lies beyond, but he senses that the Watch stands not just against physical threats, but against something deeper, something not easily explained. This awareness does not frighten him, it steadies him, because it aligns with something he has always known, even if he could not name it. That truth is often hidden beneath layers of assumption. And so, Jon becomes someone who does not dismiss what he does not yet understand. He allows space for uncertainty. This quality, rare among many, becomes one of his greatest strengths. It allows him to adapt, to learn, to grow without resistance.
As the seasons shift slowly and time passes almost unnoticed in the monotony of duty, Jon's transformation continues. He becomes more confident, not in a loud or visible way, but in a quiet certainty. He begins to trust his own judgment. This is significant because for much of his life, Jon had looked outward for validation, for confirmation of who he was. Now that need begins to fade. He does not need to be told he belongs. He feels it, not because others say it, but because he has built it. This internal stability changes how he moves through the world.
He is no longer cautious out of insecurity. He is deliberate out of understanding. This distinction is subtle, but it defines the difference between uncertainty and clarity. And Jon, slowly, is moving toward clarity. Yet even in this growth, one aspect of his identity remains unresolved.
The question of his origin, it no longer dominates his thoughts as it once did. But it has not disappeared. It lingers in quiet moments, in passing thoughts, in the spaces between action and rest. But now it no longer defines him. It is part of him, but not all of him. This is perhaps the most important development of all. Jon has learned to carry uncertainty without being controlled by it, to live with questions without needing immediate answers, to move forward even when the past remains unclear. And in doing so, he becomes something steady, not because his life is simple, but because he has learned how to navigate complexity. As another night settles over the wall and the cold stretches endlessly across the horizon, Jon stands watch, not as the boy who arrived seeking identity, but as someone who is beginning to understand what identity truly means. It is not given.
It is not inherited. It is formed through choices, through actions, through quiet moments of decision that no one else may ever see. And in those moments, beneath the vast and silent sky, Jon Snow continues to become himself. There comes a point in the slow shaping of a life when the questions that once felt urgent begin to soften. They do not disappear, but they lose their sharpness. For Jon Snow, this change does not arrive with certainty. It arrives with time. The wall continues to stand unmoving, unchanging in its form, but within it men change, quietly, gradually. Jon's days settle into rhythm, training, guard duty, shared meals in dim halls where voices rise and fall like distant waves. It is in this repetition that something important happens. He begins to understand that identity is not forged in moments of intensity alone.
It is shaped in continuity, in showing up, in doing what must be done again and again. This realization grounds him. It gives his life a structure that is no longer dependent on external validation. And yet, even within this steadiness, there are moments that leave deeper impressions. One such moment comes not through conflict, but through recognition. Jon is assigned a role closer to leadership, not formally declared, not ceremonially given, but understood. He is placed in proximity to responsibility, to observation, to decision-making. And in this position, he begins to see the watch from a different perspective, not as a recruit within it, but as a part of what sustains it. He sees the weight carried by those who lead, not just in action, but in judgment. Decisions here are not made for comfort, they are made for survival. This awareness deepens Jon's sense of duty. Duty is no longer something he performs, it becomes something he inhabits. A quiet, constant presence within him. He begins to anticipate needs, to understand patterns, to recognize when something is wrong before it is spoken. These are not skills taught in training.
They are learned through attention, and Jon, having spent much of his life observing rather than asserting, possesses this quality naturally. At the same time, his understanding of others continues to evolve. He no longer sees the men of the Watch as defined by their pasts. He sees them as they are now, capable of change, capable of loyalty, capable of purpose. This perspective allows him to connect in ways that go beyond surface interaction. He listens without judgment. He speaks without superiority. And in doing so, he becomes a presence that others find steady, reliable, not because he commands it, but because he embodies it. This quiet authority is perhaps the most significant outcome of his early formation.
It is not loud. It does not seek attention, but it holds, even in moments of uncertainty. And there are always moments of uncertainty. Beyond the wall, the unknown remains. The stories continue. Whispers of things that move in silence, of forces that do not follow the logic of men. Jon does not dismiss these stories, but neither does he allow them to consume him. He holds them in a space of awareness. This balance between belief and skepticism becomes another defining aspect of his character. He does not rush to conclusions. He does not cling to denial. He allows for complexity. And in a world where many seek simple answers, this makes him different. As time continues, Jon's internal world becomes quieter, not empty, but ordered. The conflict that once defined him, the tension between who he was and who he might be, begins to resolve.
He is no longer trying to prove himself. He is simply becoming. This does not mean he has found all answers, but he has found something more important, a way to live without needing them immediately. This acceptance does not weaken him, it strengthens him, because it allows him to act with clarity, even in uncertainty, to make decisions based not on fear, but on understanding. And slowly, without any single defining moment, Jon Snow becomes something that cannot be easily named, not just a brother of the Night's Watch, not just the boy from Winterfell, but something in between, something shaped by both. His past has not been erased, it has been integrated. The lessons of Winterfell, honor, restraint, quiet strength, remain within him, but they are no longer limited by the boundaries of that place. They have been expanded, tested, refined.
And in this process, Jon has created something new, a sense of self that is not dependent on name or origin, but on principle. As another dawn approaches, pale and distant behind the vast northern sky, Jon stands once more at his post. The cold does not feel as sharp as it once did, not because it has changed, but because he has. He no longer resists it, he endures it, and in that endurance there is meaning. Not grand, not spoken, but real. The journey that brought him here was not defined by clarity. It was defined by uncertainty, by silence, by questions that lingered without answers. And yet, through all of this, something steady has emerged, a character shaped not by certainty, but by response, not by what was given, but by what was chosen.
And so, in the quiet expanse of the north,
where time moves slowly and truth often remains hidden beneath layers of ice and memory, Jon Snow continues to form. Not all at once, not completely, but in the only way that truly matters, moment by moment, choice by choice, until one day, without realizing when it happened, the question that once defined him will no longer need to be asked. Before we speak of choices, of battles, or of leadership, we must begin with something quieter, a word: snow. In the North, it is a name given to those born outside of marriage, a simple naming convention, yet one that carries a lifetime of quiet judgment. From his earliest years, Jon does not experience rejection in loud or cruel ways. Instead, what shapes him is something subtler, something more enduring. He is included, but not entirely, loved, but with hesitation,
respected, but never fully acknowledged. This creates a psychological condition that will follow him throughout his life, a constant awareness of being slightly out of place, not an outsider, but never fully inside. He grows up surrounded by honor, structure, and moral clarity, yet he is the one element within that structure that does not fit neatly. And so, very early, Jon develops an internal question that never quite leaves him. Who am I allowed to be? This question is not asked loudly, it is not spoken often, but it exists beneath everything he does. The quiet hunger for legitimacy. Jon does not crave power in the traditional sense. He does not dream of crowns or recognition. What he craves is something far more personal and far more fragile. He wants legitimacy, not in title, but in identity. He watches others move through the world with certainty. They know their place. They know their name. Their existence fits within a narrative that others understand. Jon does not have this, and so rather than demanding recognition, he chooses a different path. He tries to earn belonging. This becomes one of the defining psychological patterns of his life. He does not assume he deserves respect. He works for it relentlessly. He measures himself constantly against an internal standard that is always just out of reach. This creates a quiet but powerful tension within him, because no matter how much he achieves, the question remains unanswered. Not, what have I done, but, do I finally belong? Love and the fear of being seen. There is another layer beneath this, a fear that runs deeper than rejection. Jon fears being truly seen, because to be seen means to be defined, and to be defined means the truth, whatever it may be, cannot be escaped. This is why his emotional connections are careful, measured, guarded. When he forms bonds, they are sincere, deep, loyal, but always with restraint, because part of him believes that if someone looks too closely, they will find something unworthy, something that confirms his quiet suspicion that he is not meant to fully belong anywhere. This fear creates a contradiction within him. He desires connection deeply, yet he instinctively holds part of himself back. And so, even in moments of closeness, there is distance. Not because he does not feel, but because he feels too much and does not trust where that feeling might lead. the weight of moral inheritance. Jon is raised in an environment where honor is not just encouraged, it is expected. But here lies another internal conflict. Honor, in its purest form, requires certainty.
It requires a clear understanding of right and wrong. Jon, however, grows up in ambiguity. He sees the world not as a fixed moral structure, but as something more fluid, more complicated. This creates a quiet fracture in his psychology. He wants to live by strict moral principles, but he also sees the limitations of those principles in a complex world. And so he carries both. He tries to act with integrity while constantly questioning whether that integrity is enough. This leads to hesitation, not weakness, but reflection. He does not act quickly because he is always measuring the consequences, not just for others, but for what those actions say about who he is. The desire to escape the self. At a certain point, Jon makes a decision that appears on the surface to be about purpose.
But psychologically, it is something else. It is an attempt to escape, not from the world, but from the uncertainty within himself. He seeks environments where identity is stripped down, where titles do not matter, where the past is irrelevant. Places where a person can be judged only by what they do, not by where they come from. This reveals something important. Jon does not want to be redefined. He wants to be unburdened. But the truth is, identity cannot be left behind so easily. No matter where he goes, the question follows him. And so, instead of escaping it, he begins to carry it more consciously. The conflict between duty and self. As Jon grows, his internal struggle becomes more complex. It is no longer just about belonging. It becomes about choice. Specifically, do I live for myself or for what I believe is right? This is not an abstract question for him. It appears in real, painful decisions, moments where personal happiness is possible, but only at the cost of something larger. And each time Jon makes the same choice, he chooses duty, not because it is easy, but because he believes that his own desires are less important than the greater good. This creates a quiet tragedy within him, because every time he denies himself, he reinforces the idea that his own needs do not matter. Over time, this becomes internalized. He does not just choose duty, he begins to believe that he is meant to choose duty. Emotional fracture, loss and responsibility. Loss shapes Jon in ways that are not always visible. He does not express grief loudly, he absorbs it. Each loss adds another layer of responsibility, another reason to continue forward, even when there is nothing left to gain personally. But this accumulation has a cost, because grief that is not expressed does not disappear, it transforms. In Jon's case, it becomes a kind of emotional heaviness, a quiet seriousness, a reluctance to trust joy. He begins to see happiness as temporary, as something that will inevitably be taken away. And so, even when moments of peace appear, he does not fully step into them. Leadership without desire,
One of the most interesting aspects of Jon's psychology is his relationship with leadership. He does not seek it, he does not enjoy it, and yet it follows him. This creates another contradiction. He becomes a leader because others trust him, but he never fully believes he deserves that trust.
This leads to a leadership style defined by reluctance rather than ambition, responsibility rather than pride, reflection rather than certainty. He listens, he questions, he hesitates, not because he lacks strength, but because he understands the weight of consequence. And yet, this same quality makes him vulnerable, because not everyone sees hesitation as thoughtfulness. Some see it as weakness. This creates tension between how Jon sees himself and how others interpret him. The identity revealed and rejected. At a certain point, the question that has followed Jon his entire life receives an answer. His identity is revealed in a way that should, in theory, resolve everything. It gives him legitimacy, it gives him status, it gives him a place in the world. But psychologically, it does not bring peace, because the problem was never the lack of identity.
It was the weight of it. And now that weight is greater than ever. Instead of freeing him, the truth creates a new conflict. If I am this person, what am I supposed to do with it? He does not embrace it easily. In fact, he resists it, because accepting it would mean stepping into a role he never wanted. And more importantly, it would mean redefining himself in a way that feels imposed rather than chosen. The final contradiction: strength and withdrawal. By the time Jon reaches the later stages of his journey, his psychology has settled into a quiet paradox. He is strong, capable, respected, and yet there is a growing distance within him. He begins to withdraw, not from responsibility, but from identity itself, because after everything, he no longer seeks to define himself through titles, roles, or expectations. He has seen what those things demand, and he has paid the cost.
So instead, he moves towards something simpler, a life where he can exist without constant evaluation, without the pressure to be something specific. There is a moment in every life where choice stops feeling like freedom and begins to feel like weight. For Jon Snow, that shift happens gradually. At first, his decisions are guided by instinct, by the desire to do what feels right. But over time, something changes. Each choice begins to carry consequences that extend far beyond himself. And this creates a new kind of tension, because when every decision affects others, there is no longer a safe option, only trade-offs. Jon becomes increasingly aware that doing what is right does not guarantee a good outcome, that even the most principled decision can lead to loss, misunderstanding, or unintended harm. This realization alters him. He does not lose his sense of morality, but he begins to question its simplicity.
And in that questioning, we see a deepening of his inner world. He no longer asks, "What is right?" He asks, "What am I willing to carry?" Trust and the memory of betrayal.
Trust for Jon is never a light thing. It is not given easily, and once broken, it does not return unchanged. There are moments in his life where trust is placed in him, and moments where he places trust in others, and in both directions, the consequences leave lasting impressions. Psychologically, this creates a subtle shift. He does not become cynical. He does not close himself off entirely, but he becomes careful, measured in his expectations. He understands that loyalty is not guaranteed, that shared purpose does not always mean shared values, and yet, despite this awareness, he continues to trust, not blindly,
but deliberately. This is important because it reveals something fundamental about him. Jon does not trust because the world is safe. He trusts because he chooses to believe that connection is still worth the risk, even when experience suggests otherwise. The quiet cost of leadership. Leadership, as it settles more firmly onto his shoulders, begins to reshape not just his actions, but his internal experience of the world. He becomes more alone, not physically, but psychologically, because leadership introduces a kind of distance that cannot easily be bridged. Others look to him for answers, but he often has none that feel certain. Others expect clarity, but he sees only complexity. This creates an internal isolation. He cannot fully share his doubts. He cannot express uncertainty in the same way he once could, and so he carries those thoughts inward. This is where a subtle transformation occurs. Jon begins to separate his inner self from his outward role. Externally, he appears steady, decisive when necessary, grounded. Internally, he is still questioning, still weighing, still unsure, and this duality becomes part of his identity. He is both the one who leads and the one who quietly wonders if he should. Desire as a disruption. Throughout his life, Jon learns to suppress personal desire, not because he lacks it, but because it complicates everything. Desire introduces uncertainty. It creates competing priorities. It challenges the clarity of duty. And so he develops a pattern. When desire and responsibility conflict, he chooses responsibility. But suppression is not the same as absence. Desire does not disappear. It lingers. And when it surfaces, unexpectedly, powerfully, it disrupts the careful balance he has constructed. These moments are not loud or dramatic. They are quiet internal disturbances, a hesitation, a second thought.
A fleeting question of what if? And each time he must decide again, do I allow myself to feel this? Or do I return to what is expected? Over time, this repeated suppression shapes him. He becomes someone who is deeply connected to others, yet rarely allows himself to fully experience that connection. The fragmentation of identity. As Jon moves through different roles, outsider, brother, leader, symbol, his sense of self begins to fragment, not in a chaotic way, but in a layered one. Each role carries its own expectations, its own version of who he is supposed to be. And the challenge is not choosing between them, it is holding them all at once. This creates an internal tension.
the part of him that seeks simplicity, the part of him that accepts complexity, the part of him that wants to belong, the part of him that has learned to stand apart. He is never fully one thing, and this, perhaps more than anything, defines his psychological experience. He is always balancing, always adjusting, always navigating between identities rather than settling into one: memory and the weight of the past. Memory for Jon is not just recollection, it is influence. Each experience does not simply remain in the past, it continues to shape how he perceives the present. Loss informs caution. Responsibility informs restraint. Moments of connection inform longing. But there is something else, a kind of quiet accumulation. He does not revisit the past often. He does not dwell on it openly, but it is always there, beneath the surface, guiding decisions in subtle ways. This creates a sense of continuity within him. Even as his circumstances change, even as his roles shift, the core experiences that shaped him remain active.
Not as memories he reflects on, but as instincts he lives through. The search for stillness. After years of movement, of conflict, decision, responsibility, there emerges a quieter desire within Jon, not for recognition, not for resolution, but for stillness, a space where he does not have to choose, where he does not have to define himself, where he does not have to carry the expectations of others. This desire is not about escape, it is about balance, about returning to a state where existence is not tied to constant evaluation. And this is where we begin to see a shift. He does not abandon who he is, but he begins to loosen his attachment to what others expect him to be.
The final shape of his inner world. If we look at Jon Snow not as a figure of action, but as a figure of inner experience, we begin to see a pattern that is both complex and deeply human. He is shaped by contradiction. He seeks belonging, yet stands apart. He values connection, yet guards himself. He carries responsibility, yet questions his right to do so. He acts with conviction, yet lives with doubt. These contradictions are not flaws, they are the structure of his identity. He is not meant to resolve them, he is meant to live with them. And over time he does. Not perfectly, not without struggle, but with a kind of quiet acceptance. Strength, in Jon's case, is often misunderstood. To others, it appears as resilience.
Endurance, a quiet ability to continue even when circumstances become overwhelming. But internally, that strength is not built on certainty. It is built on fear. Not fear of enemies, not fear of failure in the ordinary sense, but a more intimate fear, the fear of becoming someone he cannot respect. This fear guides him more than ambition ever could. He does not act bravely because he feels fearless. He acts because the alternative, inaction, compromise, moral surrender, feels like a deeper kind of loss. And so his strength is not the absence of fear. It is the refusal to let that fear reshape his core values. Yet this comes at a cost, because when strength is maintained through constant resistance,
it becomes exhausting, and that exhaustion does not always show. It remains internal, quiet, accumulated. Guilt as a constant companion. There is another presence within Jon's inner world, not loud, not overwhelming, but persistent. Guilt, not always tied to a single event, not always rational, but present.
He carries responsibility not only for what he has done, but for what has happened around him. Even when outcomes are beyond his control, he feels their weight. This creates a psychological pattern. He reflects deeply on his decisions. He replays moments internally. He questions whether different choices could have led to better outcomes. This is not regret in its simplest form. It is something more complex, a sense that every action, no matter how necessary, leaves behind consequences that must be carried, and Jon carries them without complaint, without release. The difficulty of self-forgiveness. Forgiving others comes more easily to him than forgiving himself, because when others fail, he sees context, circumstance, complexity. But when he fails, or believes he has failed, he sees only responsibility. This creates a quiet imbalance. He extends understanding outward, but not inward. And over time, this becomes part of his identity.
He does not expect peace from himself. He expects accountability, constant, unyielding. This is why moments of stillness feel unfamiliar to him, because stillness requires a kind of internal acceptance, and that is something he has rarely allowed himself. Isolation within connection. Even when surrounded by others, even when trusted, respected, and followed, Jon experiences a form of isolation that is difficult to describe. It is not loneliness in the traditional sense. It is the awareness that no one else carries exactly what he carries. No one else sees the same combination of past, responsibility, and uncertainty. And so, while he connects with others, there is always a part of him that remains separate, not intentionally, but inevitably. This creates a subtle emotional distance. He listens, he understands, he cares deeply, but he does not always feel fully understood in return. And over time, this becomes something he accepts, not as a flaw, but as part of what it means to be who he is. The question of worth. At the center of many of Jon's internal struggles is a question that rarely surfaces directly, but influences everything. Am I enough? Not in terms of skill or strength, but in terms of worth. This question originates early, and it evolves. At first, it is tied to identity, to name, to place. Later, it becomes tied to action. Have I done enough? Have I protected enough? Have I chosen correctly? And eventually, it becomes quieter, more difficult to answer, because no matter how much he gives, the question does not fully disappear. This is not because he lacks value, but because he measures himself against a standard that is constantly moving, a standard shaped by responsibility, loss, and expectation. The soft emergence of acceptance. And yet,
Despite all of this, something changes. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. Jon begins to shift, not in what he does, but in how he holds himself. The questions remain, the doubts do not vanish, but they lose their sharpness. They become part of the background rather than the center. He no longer seeks to answer everything. He no longer feels the need to resolve every internal contradiction. Instead, he begins to allow them to exist without immediate judgment, without constant correction. This is a subtle form of growth, not the kind that transforms a person into something new, but the kind that allows a person to rest within who they already are. Letting go of the need to prove. For much of his life, Jon is driven by a need to prove something, not to others, but to himself, that he belongs, that he is capable, that he is worthy.
But over time, this need begins to fade, not because he has proven everything, but because he begins to see that proof was never the solution, that worth is not something that can be fully earned through action. It is something that must be accepted, even in uncertainty. This realization does not come easily. It is not a single moment. It is a gradual release, a loosening of the internal pressure that has followed him for so long. A different kind of strength. What remains in the end is a different kind of strength, not the strength of endurance alone, but the strength of quiet acceptance, the ability to continue without needing to resolve every question, to carry responsibility without losing oneself completely within it, to feel deeply without retreating entirely from connection. This strength is not visible in dramatic ways. It does not announce itself.
But it is steady, consistent, and deeply human. And as the silence grows deeper, not empty, but full, we move into the final, most delicate layer of his inner world. Not the struggles that shaped him, not the choices that defined him, but what remains when all of that begins to quiet. The echo of identity. For much of his life, Jon Snow has lived in relation to something, a name, a duty, a role. Even his doubts were tied to these things. But when those structures begin to loosen, something unfamiliar appears, a kind of stillness that is not immediately comforting, because without constant direction, without expectation pressing inward, there is space. And space, for someone like Jon, can feel uncertain. At first, it almost resembles absence. If I am not defined by what I must do, then what remains? This is not a question he rushes to answer.
Because for the first time, perhaps, there is no urgency behind it, only quiet observation. The memory of who he was, even as he moves forward. The past does not disappear, but it changes form. It is no longer something that demands correction, but something that informs understanding. Jon begins slowly to see his earlier self with a different perspective, not as incomplete, not as someone who needed to become more, but as someone who was always adapting, doing what he could with what he understood at the time. This shift is subtle but profound because it allows something that was previously difficult, compassion, directed inward. He does not erase his mistakes. He does not reinterpret them into something easy, but he no longer holds them with the same sharpness. They become part of a larger picture.
Not something to be corrected,
but something to be acknowledged. The silence between thoughts. There is a kind of quiet that begins to settle within him, not the silence of isolation, but the silence of less resistance. His thoughts, once constant and questioning, begin to slow, not because the questions are gone, but because they no longer demand immediate answers. This creates space, and within that space, there is rest, a rare kind of rest, not physical, but internal, the kind that comes when a person no longer feels the need to resolve everything at once. Living without constant meaning. Jon's life has been shaped by meaning. Every action, every decision, every sacrifice has been tied to something larger. But now, that connection loosens, not disappears, but softens. And with that softening comes something unfamiliar, the ability to exist without attaching significance to every moment, to act without needing to justify, to move without needing to define.
This is not emptiness. It is freedom. A freedom that does not come from escape, but from release. The absence of urgency. Perhaps the most noticeable change is the absence of urgency. For so long, everything required immediate response. Every choice mattered. Every moment carried weight. But now, there is time. Not in the literal sense, but in how he experiences it. Moments are no longer measured by consequence. They are simply lived. And in this slower rhythm, Jon begins to notice things he once overlooked. Small details, quiet interactions, subtle shifts in feeling. Not because they are important, but because they are present. The return to simplicity. There is a part of Jon that always longed for something simpler, not an easy life, but a clear one, a life where identity is not questioned constantly, where belonging does not need to be earned repeatedly. And now, in this quieter phase, he moves closer to that simplicity.
Not by changing who he is, but by changing how he relates to himself. He no longer measures every action. He no longer evaluates every thought. He allows himself to exist without constant interpretation. A different relationship with the world. As his inner world settles, his relationship with the world shifts as well. He no longer approaches everything as something to be resolved. He listens more, not just to others, but to the space between words. He observes, not to analyze, but to understand without pressure. This creates a different kind of connection, less driven, less defined, but more genuine, because it is no longer shaped by expectation. The quiet integration. All the parts of Jon, the uncertainty, the strength, the doubt, the responsibility, begin to integrate, not into a perfect whole, but into something balanced. He does not lose his depth. He does not lose his awareness.
But he no longer feels divided by them. The contradictions remain, but they no longer conflict. They coexist. Before any sword was drawn, before any oath was spoken, there was a quieter division. Jon grows up in Winterfell, not as a son, but as something slightly outside of belonging. He eats at the same tables, walks the same halls, trains in the same yards, yet carries a different name, a word that follows him like a shadow.
bastard. This is not a single moment, but it becomes one, slowly, steadily, as awareness forms. The turning point arrives not through an event, but through recognition. He begins to understand that no matter how honorable Eddard Stark is, no matter how kind some around him may be, there are limits to what he can become within this world. This realization does something subtle but permanent. It separates identity from belonging.
Jon begins to define himself not by what he is given, but by what he must choose. And from that moment forward, choice, not birth, becomes the center of his life. The decision to take the black. The journey to the Night's Watch is often remembered as a physical departure, but the true turning point happens before the road is taken. It happens in the quiet belief that this is the only place where a man can become more than what he was born as. Jon does not leave Winterfell in bitterness alone. There is hope in him, a quiet belief that the Wall offers something pure, a place where past names dissolve and honor is rebuilt through action. But this belief is incomplete, and its collapse becomes one of his first true transformations. Disillusionment at the Wall. When Jon arrives at Castle Black, he expects brotherhood. Instead, he finds something harsher.
The recruits are not noble sons seeking purpose. They are thieves, outcasts, broken men. The Watch itself is not an elite order, but a fading institution, surviving more on memory than strength. This realization is not dramatic, it is quiet, heavy, and it reshapes him. Jon begins to understand that honor is not something preserved by systems. It must be carried, even when the system has already failed. This shifts his thinking permanently. He no longer looks for places that are pure. He begins to accept that meaning must be created within flawed worlds. The first kill beyond the Wall. The first time Jon is ordered to kill, it is not in battle. It is not in chaos. It is deliberate. The moment comes when he must prove loyalty to the Night's Watch by killing a man he has come to understand.
The weight of this decision is not in the act itself, but in the fracture it creates. Until now, Jon believes in a clear structure of right and wrong. Loyalty, honor, duty, these feel aligned. But here, they diverge. To remain loyal, he must betray something deeper. And when he does it, something inside him shifts. He learns that survival within systems of power often requires moral compromise. But more importantly, he learns that he is capable of it. This knowledge stays with him. It makes him quieter, more measured, because now he understands that identity is not fixed by intention, but tested by action. Living among the free folk. Perhaps one of the most profound turning points in Jon's life is not a battle, but a crossing. When he lives among the free folk, those once considered enemies, he experiences something unfamiliar.
Perspective. For the first time, Jon sees the world not through inherited beliefs, but through lived contradiction. The free folk are not monsters. They are people shaped by different rules, different necessities, different truths. This realization does not come instantly. It unfolds slowly, through observation, through conversation, through connection, and through love. The emotional conflict of Ygritte. His relationship with Ygritte is not simply romantic, it is transformative. She challenges him, not with force, but with clarity. "You know nothing, Jon Snow." The words repeat, not as insult, but as revelation. She forces him to confront the limits of his understanding, and for the first time, Jon begins to question not just others, but himself. The fracture of loyalty. The turning point comes when Jon must choose again, but this time the choice is more complex. He is no longer choosing between duty and desire. He is choosing between two truths: the Night's Watch and the Free Folk. Both have claims on him. Both feel real. And whichever he chooses, he will betray something meaningful. When he returns to the Watch, leaving Ygritte behind, it is not a victory of loyalty. It is a loss, a quiet, irreversible loss, and it leaves him changed. He becomes more cautious with belief, more aware that truth is rarely singular. The battle at the Wall. When the Free Folk attack the Wall, Jon stands not just against enemies, but against people he has lived among. This moment transforms conflict itself. It is no longer abstract. Every strike, every defense carries emotional weight. He is not defending against strangers. He is fighting against a world he came to understand. The death of Ygritte. The death of Ygritte is not dramatic in its effect on Jon. It is still, quiet, final, and it deepens something already forming within him. Grief, yes, but also clarity. Jon begins to understand that connection does not protect against consequence, that love does not prevent loss, and that choices, even necessary ones, leave marks that do not fade. From this point forward, Jon becomes more restrained, not colder, but more aware. He carries the understanding that every decision will cost something. Becoming Lord Commander, Jon's election as Lord Commander is not a triumph. It is a burden placed upon someone not yet certain of himself. And that uncertainty becomes the core of this turning point. Leadership without certainty. Jon does not step into leadership with confidence. He steps into it with hesitation, with questions, and that shapes the kind of leader he becomes. He does not lead through authority alone. He listens, he observes, he considers, but this also isolates him. Because leadership demands decisions, even when clarity is absent. The choice to ally with the Free Folk. One of the most defining moments of his leadership is the decision to allow the Free Folk south of the Wall. This choice is not strategic alone, it is philosophical. Jon acts on what he has learned, that the true threat is not each other, but what lies beyond. But the men he leads do not share this perspective, and this creates tension. Isolation deepens because now Jon is not just separate from others by birth, but by belief. The consequence, betrayal. The ultimate turning point arrives quietly, not in battle, not in chaos, but in trust,
breaking. When Jon is betrayed by his own brothers of the Night's Watch, it is not just a physical attack, it is the collapse of something deeper.
The belief that shared purpose creates unity. In his final moments before death, there is no anger described, only recognition that even with intention, even with sacrifice, misunderstanding can still lead to destruction. And this moment ends not just a chapter of his life, but a version of himself. Death and return. Jon's return from death is not treated as a victory, it is a transformation, because death changes perspective in ways that cannot be reversed. The loss of certainty. After returning, Jon is no longer guided by the same sense of duty. Something has quieted within him. The rigid structure of oaths and expectations loosens. He does not abandon responsibility, but he no longer defines himself by it. This is a subtle but profound shift. For the first time, Jon begins to act not because he must, but because he chooses to.
The Battle of the Bastards. This battle is often remembered for its scale, but for Jon, its significance lies elsewhere. It is a confrontation not just with an enemy, but with identity itself. Facing Ramsay Bolton is not simply strategic, it is personal. It is about reclaiming something long denied. Recklessness and resolve. At one moment in the battle, Jon charges forward alone, not because it is wise, but because something within him refuses to wait. This moment reveals a contradiction that has always existed in him. He is both thoughtful and impulsive, both careful and willing to risk everything. And this contradiction does not resolve, it becomes part of who he is. Learning his true identity. Perhaps the most profound turning point in Jon's life is not external, it is internal. The revelation that he is not who he believed himself to be.
That his identity,
And in that moment, he chooses not power, but responsibility, not desire, but consequence. When Jon Snow opens his eyes again, the world has not changed, but he has. Death is not described to him in detail, and he does not describe it to others. Yet something is unmistakably altered. There is a quiet absence where certainty once lived. Before, Jon acted within a structure, duty, oath, honor. Even when conflicted, he believed those ideas would guide him somewhere meaningful. After death, that structure feels thinner, not broken, but distant. Letting go of the watch. One of the first choices he makes is to leave the Night's Watch. This is not rebellion, it is release. Jon has already given everything to that identity. He lived for it, died for it, and now, having returned, he no longer feels bound by it.
This moment is a turning point because it marks the first time Jon steps outside a role he once believed defined him completely. He does not replace it with a new identity immediately. He allows space, and in that space, something rare begins to form, a version of himself that is not entirely shaped by expectation. Reclaiming Winterfell, a different motivation. When Jon turns his attention toward Winterfell, it is not driven by ambition.
It is driven by responsibility and something quieter, a need to restore balance, to correct something that feels wrong. The influence of Sansa. His reunion with Sansa Stark becomes a subtle but important shift. Sansa is not the same person he once knew, and neither is he. Their dynamic is cautious at first, two people who share history but have been shaped by entirely different paths of survival.
But over time, something forms between them that Jon has rarely experienced: mutual reliance. Sansa sees what Jon struggles to admit, that he is not simply reacting to the world anymore, he is shaping it. And through her, Jon begins to accept leadership not as a burden alone, but as something necessary. Being named king in the north. When the northern lords name Jon as their king, it is not something he seeks, and that is precisely what defines the moment. The reluctant crown. Jon does not rise with pride, he rises with hesitation, because he understands what leadership costs. He has seen what happens when leaders believe too strongly in their own rightness. So when he accepts, it is not from desire, but from acceptance of consequence. This changes the way he leads. He does not chase power, he carries it carefully, and this creates a quiet tension within him.
Because even as others see strength, Jon feels uncertainty. Meeting Daenerys, collision of beliefs. When Jon meets Daenerys Targaryen, it is not just an alliance forming, it is a confrontation of worldviews, two forms of leadership. Daenerys believes in destiny, Jon believes in responsibility. She sees the world as something to be claimed and reshaped. Jon sees it as something fragile, requiring protection. Their interaction becomes a turning point, not because of conflict, but because of reflection. Jon begins to see what happens when power is pursued with certainty, and Daenerys, in turn, sees someone who carries authority without seeking it. Trust and vulnerability. As their relationship deepens, Jon allows himself something he has often avoided: trust, and with it, vulnerability. This is significant because Jon has learned repeatedly that closeness often leads to loss, yet here he chooses connection again. Not because it is safe, but because it feels necessary. This decision shapes everything that follows. The war against the dead. The threat beyond the wall, once dismissed, once doubted, becomes real. And in facing it, Jon confronts something that has always guided him: the belief that survival requires unity. The long night. During the battle against the dead, Jon is not defined by a single act. He is defined by persistence. He continues moving, continues fighting, continues leading, even when outcomes are uncertain. This moment reinforces something that has been building within him: that leadership is not about control, it is about endurance, about continuing even when clarity is absent. The weight of survival. When the battle ends, there is no triumph in Jon's expression, only relief and exhaustion, because survival does not erase what was lost, and Jon understands that each victory carries its own quiet cost.
the truth about his name. The revelation of Jon's true identity, his lineage, his place in the world, returns here, not as new information, but as something that must now be faced. Identity versus desire. Jon does not reject the truth, but he does not embrace it either, because everything he has built within himself was formed without it. He has lived as an outsider, as a brother, as a leader, and now he is told he is something more. But to him, it does not feel like more. It feels like disruption. The distance it creates. This knowledge begins to create distance between him and Daenerys, not immediately, but gradually, because where Jon sees complexity, Daenerys begins to see threat. And this shift is subtle. It does not erupt all at once. It unfolds quietly, in glances, in hesitations, in unspoken concerns.
The fall of Daenerys, the moment that defines Jon's final transformation, is not a battle. It is a realization that someone he trusted, someone he chose to believe in, is no longer aligned with the world he hoped to protect. The conflict within Jon. Jon does not act immediately because his nature resists decisive judgment when emotion is involved. He searches for reasons, for explanations, for a way to reconcile what he sees with what he believed. But slowly, painfully, he understands that some paths cannot be corrected, only stopped. The final decision. When Jon makes his final choice, it is not driven by anger. It is driven by acceptance that doing what is necessary does not always feel right, that protecting others may require personal loss. And in that moment he acts, not as a king, not as a claimant, but as someone who has learned again and again that responsibility often demands sacrifice.
Exile. Returning to the edge. After everything, Jon does not end his journey at the center of power. He returns to the edge, beyond the wall. A quiet resolution. This is not exile as punishment alone. It is also a return to something simpler, a world without crowns, without competing claims, without the constant tension between identity and expectation. Here, Jon does not need to define himself through roles. He exists more quietly. When Jon Snow rides north once more, it does not feel like a return to where he began, because he is not the same man who once stood at the gates of the wall, searching for purpose. This time, there is no illusion waiting for him, no expectation that the world beyond holds answers. The absence of structure. For most of his life, Jon existed within systems: Winterfell, the Night's Watch, the North, war. Each gave him a framework, rules, responsibilities, roles.
Now, for the first time, those structures fall away. There is no title guiding his actions, no oath defining his identity. And this creates something unfamiliar, not fear, but stillness. Learning to exist without purpose. This may be one of the quietest yet most profound turning points in Jon's life, because until now, every action has been tied to something larger: duty, survival, protection. But beyond the wall, there is no immediate demand placed upon him, no urgent threat, no crown to carry. And so, Jon must confront something he has never truly faced before: who he is when nothing is required of him. The people of the free North. Among the free folk, Jon is no longer an outsider, but he is not fully one of them either. And yet, there is acceptance, not based on blood, not based on status, but on shared experience, a different kind of belonging. This belonging is quieter than anything Jon has known. It is not declared, it is not formalized. It exists in simple gestures, in walking together, in shared silence, in mutual understanding without explanation. And for someone who has spent a lifetime navigating identity through contrast, this is something new. No need to prove himself. For the first time, Jon does not need to justify his place. He is not the bastard of Winterfell, not the Lord Commander, not the king in the north, not a hidden heir. He is simply present, and that simplicity carries its own quiet weight, because it removes the tension he has always carried between who he is and who he is expected to be. Memory without conflict. The past does not disappear, it remains with him.
But its presence changes. The shape of loss. Jon has known loss in many forms: family, love, trust, certainty. But beyond the wall, these losses are no longer active wounds. They become something else. Memory, not erased, but softened. Ygritte and what remains. The memory of Ygritte does not return as pain. It returns as understanding. She was not only someone he loved, she was someone who changed how he saw the world. And that change remains, quietly shaping how he moves, how he listens, how he chooses. Daenerys and the weight of choice. The memory of Daenerys Targaryen is different. It carries more complexity, because it is tied not only to loss, but to decision. Jon does not revisit that moment with clarity. He does not resolve it completely. Instead, it becomes something he carries without full understanding. And perhaps that is part of his final transformation.
Accepting that not every choice can be made peaceful after the fact. The quiet shift in identity. Throughout his life, Jon has asked, in different ways, where do I belong? But beyond the wall, the question changes. It becomes less about place and more about presence. No longer defined by origin. The question of his birth, his name, his lineage loses its urgency, not because it is unimportant, but because it no longer determines his direction. Jon no longer moves toward a role he must fulfill. He moves within a life he has chosen to accept. The end of internal division. For much of his life, Jon exists between identities, Stark and not Stark, brother and outsider, leader and reluctant participant. But now, those divisions begin to quiet, not resolved through answers, but through acceptance. He does not need to be one thing. He can exist without defining it. A life without witness. Another quiet transformation emerges in this final stage of his life. For the first time, Jon is no longer being observed, no legacy to uphold. There are no expectations placed upon him, no history being written, no people waiting for his decisions. And this absence changes the nature of his actions. He no longer acts for outcome. He acts simply because it feels right in the moment. The freedom of obscurity. This is not the kind of freedom that comes with triumph. It is the kind that comes with distance, from power, from consequence, from recognition. And in that distance, Jon experiences something he has rarely known. Peace. Not perfect, not permanent, but present. The final turning point. Acceptance. If there is one final transformation in Jon Snow's life, it is not marked by an event. It is marked by a shift. A quiet internal acceptance. Letting go of resolution. Jon does not solve every conflict within himself. He does not find clear answers to every question. He does not reconcile every part of his past. Instead, he allows those things to exist without needing to change them. Living with what remains. This may be the most human part of his journey, to carry contradictions without needing to resolve them, to remember without being consumed, to move forward without certainty. Long after titles fall away, leadership does not fully disappear from within Jon Snow. It lingers quietly, not as authority, but as instinct. Responsibility without command. Beyond the wall, there is no council asking for decisions, no soldiers waiting for orders, and yet Jon still notices things others might ignore. The shifting of weather, the unease in silence, the tension before something changes. He does not announce these observations.
He does not gather people to follow him, but he remains aware, because leadership for him was never about being followed. It was about paying attention, choosing not to lead. There is a subtle turning point hidden here, not in becoming a leader, but in choosing not to be one. Jon no longer steps forward automatically. He allows others to move first, to decide, to act. And this restraint is new, because for much of his life, he stepped forward when others could not. Now, he understands that stepping back can be its own kind of wisdom. The memory of power. Power leaves a mark even when it is gone. The weight that no longer exists. Jon once carried decisions that shaped the lives of thousands. Now his choices affect only those nearby. And at first, this absence feels unfamiliar, almost like something is missing. Not desire, but weight.
Relief without celebration. There is no moment where Jon feels relief as something sudden or overwhelming. It arrives gradually in small realizations that no one is waiting for him to decide the fate of others, that no single choice will alter the course of nations. And in that quiet absence, there is space to breathe. Time moving differently. Time, too, changes its shape, from urgency to continuity. Jon's life was once defined by urgency, battles approaching, decisions required, consequences immediate. But beyond the wall, time stretches. Days are not measured by events, but by continuity, one moment flowing into the next. The disappearance of deadlines. There are no deadlines here, no expectations of when something must happen, and this shifts Jon's awareness. He begins to notice things he once overlooked: the rhythm of footsteps in snow, the subtle changes in light, the way silence is not empty, but full.
The quiet presence of ghost. Not all connections from Jon's past are lost. Some remain in simpler forms. Companionship without words. Ghost remains beside him, unchanged by politics, unaffected by titles. Their bond does not require explanation. It exists without tension, without expectation. A reflection of self. In Ghost, Jon finds something familiar, a being that has always existed slightly outside of structures, loyal but independent, present but not defined by others. And in that reflection, Jon recognizes something about himself, that perhaps he was never meant to fully belong within systems, only to move through them. The absence of conflict. For much of his life, Jon existed within conflict, external and internal. No enemy to define him. Beyond the wall, there is no clear enemy, no opposing force shaping his identity through resistance. And this creates a different kind of stillness, because conflict often provides clarity.
It defines direction. Without it, direction must come from somewhere else. Living without opposition, Jon no longer defines himself by what he stands against. He begins, slowly, to define himself by what he allows, what he notices, what he chooses not to disturb. A different understanding of strength. Strength, once measured through endurance and sacrifice, begins to change. Strength as stillness, Jon no longer needs to prove resilience. He no longer needs to demonstrate endurance through suffering. Instead, strength becomes something quieter, the ability to remain present, to not react immediately, to allow things to unfold. The end of constant resistance. For much of his life, Jon resisted something: expectations, enemies, fate. Now resistance softens, not because he has surrendered, but because he no longer feels the need to push against everything. The final shape of his journey. If we step back now, gently, we can see the full arc not as a line, but as a transformation of perspective.
From seeking to accepting. Jon begins as someone seeking belonging, purpose, recognition.
Each turning point strips away one of these pursuits until what remains is not seeking but accepting. From action to awareness, his life begins in action, decisions made quickly, paths chosen under pressure. It ends in awareness, in observation, in presence, in the ability to exist without needing to change everything around him. The Stark children, belonging without acceptance. Jon's earliest relationships form within Winterfell, among the Stark children. Robb, Arya, Sansa, Bran, and Rickon grow beside him, sharing the same halls, the same lessons, the same cold northern air. Yet even here, something remains slightly out of reach. Robb Stark represents the closest thing Jon has to a brother in the fullest sense. Their connection is built on equality, training together, laughing together, imagining futures that feel shared.
Through Robb, Jon experiences what it means to belong, even if only partially. Robb treats him not as a bastard, but as family. This shapes Jon's early belief that bonds are not defined by birth, but by loyalty. And yet, even in that closeness, there is an unspoken boundary. Robb is heir to Winterfell. Jon is not. That quiet difference lingers beneath every shared moment. Arya Stark offers something different: recognition. Where others see Jon's status, Arya sees his spirit. Both feel like outsiders in their own ways. Both resist expectations placed upon them. Their bond is not just affection, but understanding. Through Arya, Jon learns that identity is not something assigned, it is something chosen. Sansa, by contrast, reflects the world Jon cannot enter. Her distance is not cruelty, but conditioning. She represents the societal structure that defines Jon as lesser. Through her, Jon becomes aware of how deeply the world believes in titles and bloodlines.
This awareness plants the seed of quiet resilience in him. These early relationships do not simply shape Jon's emotions, they establish his lifelong tension between belonging and separation. He learns very early that love does not always erase distance. Catelyn Stark, the presence of rejection. Among all relationships in Winterfell, none shapes Jon's emotional foundation more quietly and more deeply than his connection with Catelyn Stark. There is no overt cruelty, no dramatic confrontation. Instead, there is absence, cold acknowledgement, a refusal to accept him as part of the family. For Jon, this becomes his first experience of rejection, not through action, but through feeling. Catelyn does not need to speak her disapproval. It exists in the way she looks at him or avoids looking at him entirely. This relationship teaches Jon something lasting, that love is not guaranteed, even when proximity suggests it should be. It creates in him a sense of restraint,
a tendency to hold back, to not assume he deserves warmth. But it also sharpens his sense of justice. Because he knows what it feels like to be judged for something beyond his control, Jon becomes less willing to judge others in the same way. This quiet emotional wound becomes the root of his empathy, especially toward those who stand outside society's accepted boundaries. Catelyn does not guide Jon through kindness, she shapes him through absence.
Ned Stark, honor without explanation. If Catelyn represents distance, Eddard Stark represents something far more complex. Ned is both father and mystery to Jon. He raises him, protects him, and gives him a place within Winterfell. Yet he never explains Jon's true origins. There is love, but it is incomplete, guarded by silence. From Ned, Jon inherits his deepest guiding principle, honor. But this inheritance is not simple.
Jon watches Ned navigate a world where honor often comes at great cost. He learns that doing what is right does not always lead to reward. Sometimes it leads to loss. Ned's refusal to explain Jon's past creates a quiet tension in their relationship. Jon feels both gratitude and distance. He trusts Ned, yet senses there is something unspoken between them. This shapes Jon's own approach to leadership later in life. He becomes a man who values truth, yet understands that truth can be dangerous. A man who seeks clarity, yet knows that some answers may never come. Ned does not just raise Jon, he gives him a moral framework, one that Jon will follow, even when it leads him into isolation. The Night's Watch, brotherhood and division. When Jon arrives at the Wall, he enters a new kind of relationship, chosen brotherhood.
The Night's Watch strips away titles. Bastards, nobles, criminals, all stand equal under its vows. For Jon, this offers something he has never fully experienced before, a place where his birth does not define him. His bond with Samwell Tarly becomes especially significant. Sam is vulnerable, unsure, and often afraid. Jon, recognizing something of himself in Sam's outsider status, chooses to protect him. This relationship reveals Jon's instinct to defend those who cannot defend themselves. Through Sam, Jon learns that strength is not always physical. It can exist in loyalty, in knowledge, in quiet courage. But the Night's Watch is not free of conflict. Alysser Thorne represents resistance to Jon's presence. Where Jon seeks unity, Thorne sees hierarchy. Their rivalry is not personal, it is ideological. Thorne believes in order through dominance. Jon believes in fairness through respect. This tension teaches Jon an important lesson. Leadership is not about being accepted by all.
It is about standing firm, even when acceptance is withheld. Later, as Lord Commander, Jon's relationships within the Watch grow more complex. He must balance friendship with authority, trust with responsibility, and eventually he learns that even those who call him brother may turn against him. The betrayal at the Wall is not just a physical act, it is the breaking of a bond Jon believed was unshakable. It reinforces a painful truth: loyalty, even when sworn, is never absolute. Ygritte, love beyond boundaries. Among all Jon's relationships, his connection with Ygritte stands apart. She is not from his world. She does not follow his rules. She challenges him, not through opposition, but through perspective. Ygritte represents freedom, a life beyond the rigid structures Jon has always known. Through her,
Jon experiences love not defined by duty or expectation, but by presence.
This relationship forces Jon into his deepest internal conflict. To love Ygritte is to question everything he has been taught. To remain loyal to the Night's Watch is to betray that love. There is no easy resolution. Jon chooses duty, but that choice does not erase the connection. It lingers, shaping how he understands sacrifice. Through Ygritte, Jon learns that doing the right thing does not mean escaping pain. Sometimes it means accepting it fully. Her loss leaves a quiet imprint on him, not as regret, but as understanding. He begins to see that love and loyalty are not always aligned, and that choosing one may mean losing the other. The free folk, enemies turned people. Jon's relationship with the free folk evolves from hostility to understanding. At first, they are simply enemies, wildlings beyond the wall, a threat to be contained. But as Jon lives among them, that perception changes.
Through figures like Mance Rayder and Tormund Giantsbane, Jon begins to see the free folk not as a single entity, but as individuals, people with fears, hopes, and reasons for their actions. This shift is subtle but transformative. It challenges Jon's sense of identity. If the enemy is not truly different, then what defines sides? His decision to ally with the free folk creates one of his greatest conflicts. It places him at odds with his own brothers in the Night's Watch. It forces him to choose between tradition and survival. Jon chooses survival, not just for himself, but for all. This decision reflects his growing belief that humanity cannot afford division in the face of greater threats. It marks a turning point in how he approaches leadership. But it also isolates him further, because understanding others does not guarantee they will understand you in return.
Daenerys Targaryen. Trust, power, and distance. Jon's relationship with Daenerys is built on mutual recognition. Both are leaders shaped by hardship. Both carry the weight of responsibility. Both seek to create a better world. At first, their connection is cautious. Trust must be earned. But over time, it grows into something deeper. Yet beneath that connection lies tension. Their visions, while similar in intention, differ in method. Jon values restraint. Daenerys believes in transformation through force when necessary. This difference creates a quiet imbalance. Jon respects her. He cares for her. But he also begins to see the cost of her ambition, the way power shapes her decisions. His internal conflict becomes more complex than ever before, because this is not simply about love or duty, it is about the future of the world itself. Jon's final decision in this relationship is not driven by anger or betrayal, or even personal loss.
It is driven by understanding. He recognizes that sometimes loyalty to one person must give way to responsibility toward many. It is the culmination of everything he has learned about leadership, about sacrifice, about the cost of choosing what is right. Tyrion Lannister, recognition without judgment.
Before Jon ever fully understands the scale of the world beyond Winterfell, he encounters Tyrion Lannister. Their relationship is brief in time, yet deeply influential in meaning. Tyrion is one of the first people to see Jon clearly, not as a bastard, not as a misplaced Stark, but as a person navigating a world that has already decided who he is. There is no pity in Tyrion's perspective, only recognition. Through Tyrion, Jon learns an early and important truth. Identity, when imposed by others, can either become a prison or something that can be worn with quiet strength. Tyrion does not offer Jon guidance in the traditional sense.
He offers something more subtle, permission to exist without apology. This interaction plants a seed that grows slowly throughout Jon's life. It becomes part of the reason Jon later shows patience toward those who exist outside accepted norms. He does not rush to define others because he knows what it feels like to be defined too quickly. Their paths diverge, but the impression remains. Jeor Mormont, leadership through burden. At the Wall, Jon's relationship with Jeor Mormont introduces him to a different kind of connection, one shaped by responsibility. Mormont does not treat Jon as a son, nor as a simple recruit. He observes him, tests him, places expectations upon him. In many ways, Mormont sees in Jon something that Jon has not yet fully recognized in himself. Their relationship becomes a quiet mentorship, defined less by affection and more by trust. Mormont entrusts Jon with tasks that require judgment, not just obedience.
This trust carries weight. Through Mormont, Jon learns that leadership is not about authority. It is about carrying the consequences of decisions that affect others. He also learns that leadership is often lonely. Mormont stands apart from his men, not because he chooses to, but because his role demands it. Jon watches this distance carefully, and later, when he becomes Lord Commander, he understands it not as isolation, but as necessity. Mormont's death marks a transition, not simply the loss of a leader, but the moment Jon realizes that the responsibility he once observed must now be carried by him. Samwell Tarly, loyalty without condition. Among all of Jon's relationships, few are as steady and unwavering as his bond with Samwell Tarly. Sam does not challenge Jon. He does not compete with him. He does not seek to shape him. He simply believes in him.
This kind of loyalty is rare in Jon's life. It is not tied to status or duty or expectation. It exists quietly, consistently. Through Sam, Jon experiences what it means to be trusted without hesitation. And in return, Jon learns how to support someone not through strength alone, but through patience, through understanding that not all courage looks the same. Their relationship becomes a balance. Jon offers protection, Sam offers perspective. Where Jon acts, Sam reflects. Where Jon carries burdens silently, Sam gives those burdens space to be acknowledged. In a life filled with shifting alliances and fragile trust, Sam represents something enduring,
a connection that does not fracture under pressure. Sansa Stark, distance, reunion, and relearning trust. Jon's relationship with Sansa Stark evolves more slowly than most. In childhood, there is distance. Sansa reflects the world Jon cannot access, a world of legitimacy, expectation, and structured identity.
Their interactions are polite, but not close. But when they reunite later in life, that distance changes. Not immediately and not easily. Both have endured separate hardships. Both have been shaped by different kinds of loss. And when they meet again, they are no longer the people they once were. Their relationship becomes one of careful rebuilding. Trust is not assumed. It is formed gradually through shared purpose. Together, they face the challenge of reclaiming Winterfell. This shared goal creates a bond that did not exist before, a partnership rooted not in childhood familiarity, but in mutual respect. Yet tension remains. Sansa learns to think strategically, often with caution. Jon continues to act based on instinct and principle. Their approaches do not always align. This difference creates friction, but it also strengthens their dynamic, because through that friction, both begin to understand that leadership does not require uniformity.
It requires the ability to hold different perspectives without breaking the connection between them. Their relationship becomes a quiet example of growth, not through closeness alone, but through the willingness to reconnect even after years of separation. Bran Stark, the weight of truth. Jon's connection with Bran Stark begins simply. In childhood, Bran looks up to him, sees him as an older brother, a figure of guidance. But over time, that relationship transforms into something far more complex. Bran becomes a keeper of knowledge, a presence that exists beyond ordinary understanding. And with that transformation comes a shift in how Jon relates to him. Bran is the one who reveals Jon's true identity. This revelation does not strengthen their bond in a traditional sense. Instead, it introduces distance, because the truth itself changes everything. Jon is no longer just Jon Snow, and yet, internally, he still is.
This creates a quiet dissonance. Through Bran, Jon is confronted with the idea that identity is not always something that can be integrated easily. Sometimes it creates more questions than answers. Their relationship becomes less about emotional closeness and more about shared understanding of what must be carried. Bran holds the past. Jon must live with its consequences. The Night's Watch. Again, betrayal and understanding. Returning to the Night's Watch, Jon's relationship with his brothers reaches its most painful turning point. The men he has led, protected, tried to guide, they turn against him. This betrayal is not born from hatred alone. It is born from fear, from misunderstanding, from the belief that Jon's decisions, especially his alliance with the Free Folk, threaten everything they have sworn to protect. For Jon, this moment is transformative because it forces him to confront a difficult truth.
Doing what is right does not guarantee that others will see it the same way. And sometimes leadership means being alone in that understanding. The betrayal does not make Jon bitter. It makes him clearer. He begins to accept that trust is not permanent, that loyalty must be continually upheld, not assumed, and that even the strongest bonds can fracture under pressure. Yet, even after this, Jon does not abandon his principles. That is what defines him. Tormund Giantsbane, respect across worlds. Among the free folk, Jon's relationship with Tormund Giantsbane stands as one of mutual respect. Tormund does not follow Jon because of titles. He follows him because he recognizes something genuine. Strength, yes, but also fairness. Their bond is built not through shared upbringing, but through shared experience, through survival, through facing the same threats. Tormund represents a world free of rigid hierarchy, a world where respect is earned through action, not inherited status. Through him, Jon sees a different model of leadership, one that is more instinctive, more direct, less constrained by tradition. Their relationship is not complicated by hidden tension. It is simple but meaningful, a reminder that connection does not always require similarity. Sometimes it only requires recognition. Ghost, a bond without language. Among all the relationships in Jon's life, one stands apart for its simplicity. Ghost. The direwolf is not a companion shaped by words, or by shared beliefs, or by conflicting loyalties. There are no expectations within this bond, no need to explain, or justify, or prove anything. And because of that, it becomes one of the most honest connections Jon ever experiences. Ghost is present from the beginning, silent, watchful, always near, even when unacknowledged. This relationship reflects something essential about Jon.
While many of his human connections are defined by tension, questions of identity, loyalty, or duty, his bond with Ghost exists outside of those complexities. It is steady, instinctive. Through Ghost, Jon experiences companionship without conflict. There is no need to reconcile differences, no need to bridge emotional distance. The connection simply exists. And in a life filled with uncertainty, that kind of presence becomes grounding. Even when separated, Ghost remains part of Jon's emotional landscape, a reminder that not all relationships are complicated. Some are simply constant. Melisandre, faith, doubt, and uneasy alignment. Jon's relationship with Melisandre introduces a different kind of tension, one rooted not in personal conflict, but in belief. Melisandre sees Jon as something more than a man, a figure tied to prophecy, a role within a larger unseen design. Jon does not see himself this way. This creates a quiet imbalance between them. Melisandre's faith is unwavering.
Jon's perspective is grounded in experience. He trusts what he can understand, what he can witness, what he can choose. And yet, their paths intersect in a moment that changes everything. When Jon is brought back to life,
Melisandre becomes part of one of the most profound turning points in his existence, not just physically, but emotionally, because this event forces Jon to confront something beyond logic. It raises questions he cannot fully answer. Why him? For what purpose? And what does it mean to continue living after crossing that boundary? Melisandre does not offer clarity. She offers belief. But for Jon, belief alone is not enough. Their relationship remains distant, respectful, but never fully aligned. Through her, Jon learns that faith, while powerful, cannot replace personal conviction, that meaning must be chosen, not assigned. Davos Seaworth, quiet loyalty and moral reflection. In contrast, Jon's relationship with Davos Seaworth is built on something far steadier.
Davos does not see Jon as a symbol. He sees him as a man trying to do what is right in a world that rarely rewards such effort. This shared perspective creates a bond based on mutual understanding. Davos offers guidance but never control. He advises but does not impose. His loyalty is not blind, it is considered, and that makes it stronger. Through Davos, Jon experiences a form of support that is neither emotional dependence nor hierarchical obedience. It is partnership. Davos often reflects back to Jon the consequences of his decisions, not as criticism, but as perspective. This allows Jon to remain grounded, because while Jon carries the weight of leadership, Davos ensures that weight does not isolate him completely. Their relationship demonstrates that trust does not always require deep emotional expression. Sometimes it exists in quiet consistency, in being present again and again without expectation.
The Northern Lords, authority without unity. As Jon steps into leadership beyond the Wall, his relationship with the Northern Lords introduces another layer of complexity. Unlike the Night's Watch, where brotherhood is sworn, the North is shaped by allegiance, history, and pride. The Lords respect strength, they respect lineage, and Jon, despite his actions, exists in a space that challenges both. Even when he is named King in the North, that title does not erase the underlying tension, because for many, leadership is tied to bloodline, and Jon's identity, both as a Stark and not fully a Stark, creates uncertainty. This relationship teaches Jon one of the most difficult lessons of leadership. Authority does not guarantee unity. Respect must be maintained constantly. Decisions must balance not only what is right, but what others are willing to accept. Jon often chooses principle over politics.
In this choice, while consistent with who he is, creates distance between him and those he leads. Through the Northern Lords, Jon learns that leadership in the broader world is not as simple as it was at the Wall. It requires negotiation, perception, compromise, things that do not come naturally to him. The conflict within, self as the final relationship. And beneath all these connections, there exists one relationship that is perhaps the most important and the most unresolved: Jon's relationship with himself. From the beginning, he is defined by uncertainty, not knowing where he belongs, not knowing who he truly is. Every external relationship reflects this internal tension. With the Starks, he is family,
but not fully. With the Night's Watch, he is brother, but set apart. With the free folk, he is accepted, but still different. With Daenerys, he is equal, but also a threat.
These overlapping identities create a constant question: where does he truly belong? The revelation of his true lineage does not answer this question, it deepens it. Because identity, for Jon, is not just about blood, it is about choice. And time and again, Jon chooses the same path: not power, not recognition, but responsibility. This consistency becomes the foundation of his self-understanding. He may never fully resolve who he is in the eyes of the world, but he understands what he stands for, and that becomes enough. Echoes of Robb, the shape of brotherhood. Even in silence, Jon carries the presence of Robb Stark, not as a memory of loss, but as a reference point. Robb represents a version of life that might have been simpler, a path where loyalty and identity aligned more naturally, where brotherhood did not need to be questioned. Jon often returns in thought
To that early connection, not because it defines him, but because it reminds him of who he was before the world became complicated. Through Robb, Jon understands that some relationships remain unchanged by time. They do not evolve, they do not resolve. They simply exist, steady and unaltered in memory. Arya, the continuation of understanding. With Arya Stark, the connection feels different. It is not anchored in the past, it continues. Even when separated by distance, their bond carries a quiet certainty. Arya understands Jon not through shared experience alone, but through shared nature. Both resist confinement. Both move through the world without fully belonging to it. Their relationship is not dependent on presence. It exists as recognition, and because of that, it does not require constant reinforcement. It does not fade in absence. Jon knows without needing proof that Arya remains part of his life, not as memory, but as something ongoing.
The memory of shared responsibility. Jon's connection with Sansa Stark settles into something quieter, not as emotionally immediate as Arya, not as simple as Robb, but steady. They share something that cannot be easily described: responsibility, the burden of leadership, the necessity of making decisions that affect others, the understanding that sometimes doing what is right requires distance. Their relationship becomes less about closeness and more about alignment. Even apart, they carry similar weights, and in that shared experience, there is a form of connection that does not need expression. Daenerys, the weight that does not fade. Some relationships do not become lighter with time. Jon's connection with Daenerys Targaryen remains complex, even in absence. It is not defined solely by what happened, but by what it required of him: to care for someone and to stand against them. This contradiction does not resolve. It remains.
Through Daenerys, Jon carries a lasting awareness of how power can shift intention, how belief, when absolute, can reshape even the most compassionate person. But he also carries the memory of who she was before that shift. And because of that, this relationship is not reduced to a single moment. It exists in layers: understanding, conflict, loss. Jon does not try to simplify it. He allows it to remain as it is. The free folk, a different kind of belonging. Among the free folk, Jon experiences something he had not fully known before: belonging without expectation. With figures like Tormund Giantsbane, there is no need to explain who he is, no need to justify decisions made in another life. He is accepted as he stands, not because of titles, not because of lineage, but because of what he has done and how he has lived.
This kind of belonging is different from what he experienced in Winterfell or the Night's Watch. It is not structured. It is not defined by roles. It is fluid. And in that fluidity, Jon finds a kind of ease that had always been just out of reach. The absence of conflict and what remains. For much of his life, Jon's relationships are shaped by conflict between duty and desire, between identity and expectation, between loyalty and necessity. But in this quieter chapter, conflict begins to recede, and without it, something becomes clearer. Jon does not seek relationships to define himself anymore. He carries them as part of who he already is. There is no longer a need to prove loyalty, no need to question belonging,
No need to reconcile opposing forces. What remains is understanding, a quiet reflection on a life that changed a world. There are some lives that do not seek greatness and yet reshape the meaning of it. The life of Jon Snow is one of those rare, quiet forces. He does not arrive in the world with certainty, nor with a clear sense of belonging. Instead, he begins in uncertainty, marked by questions rather than answers. And perhaps that is where his legacy truly begins, not in power, not in destiny, but in the long, quiet struggle to understand who he is and what he owes to others. In the world of Game of Thrones, where ambition often burns loudly and violently, Jon Snow's life unfolds in a different way. His influence is not defined by conquest or spectacle, but by restraint, by difficult choices, and by a persistent willingness to act against his own comfort.
And so, his legacy is not carved in stone monuments or sung only in triumph. It lives in quieter places, in the people he changed, in the cycles he interrupted, and in the fragile hope he helped preserve in a world accustomed to despair. Legacy in the world, a shift away from endless cycles. The world Jon inhabits is shaped by repetition. Violence leads to more violence. Revenge answers revenge. Power is taken, held, and lost in an endless loop that few ever question. In such a world, legacy is often measured by how much one conquers or how long one survives. But Jon's life begins to challenge that structure, not by rejecting conflict entirely, but by refusing to perpetuate its most destructive patterns. One of the most defining elements of his legacy is his refusal to see enemies as permanent. Where others see only division,
Jon repeatedly chooses to see complexity.
The boundary between friend and foe, in his understanding, is not fixed. It can change if one is willing to risk understanding instead of fear. This is perhaps most evident in his approach to the wildlings. For generations, they were seen as nothing more than threats, outsiders who must be resisted at all costs. But Jon, through lived experience rather than inherited belief, begins to see something different. He recognizes shared humanity where others see only danger. This shift is not merely personal, it alters the trajectory of entire communities. By bridging that divide, Jon disrupts a cycle that had persisted for centuries. The wall, once a symbol of separation, begins to lose its absolute meaning, not because it falls physically, but because its ideological purpose weakens. And that is where his impact becomes profound. He does not destroy the old world with force.
Instead, he introduces the possibility that it can change from within. The redefinition of leadership. In a world obsessed with titles, Jon's relationship with leadership is unusual. He never seeks it for its own sake. In fact, he often resists it. Yet again and again, he is placed in positions of authority, not because he demands them, but because others recognize something in him. His leadership is defined not by control, but by burden. Where many leaders use power to secure their own position, Jon experiences it as something heavy, something that demands sacrifice. He makes choices that isolate him, decisions that cost him loyalty, and actions that place him at odds with those closest to him. And yet he continues. This creates a new model of leadership within the world of Westeros, one that is not rooted in dominance, but in responsibility.
One that does not prioritize victory, but survival, not of oneself, but of others. This shift is subtle, but lasting. Even those who disagree with him are forced to confront a different way of thinking. His presence introduces a quiet question into the world. What if leadership is not about ruling, but about protecting? And that question lingers long after his direct influence fades. The disruption of destiny. Jon Snow's life is deeply intertwined with questions of destiny. From the moment his true heritage becomes known, he is positioned as someone who could claim immense power. His lineage connects him to both fire and ice, to ancient legacies that shaped the world long before he was born. And yet, what defines his legacy is not that he fulfills destiny in the expected way, but that he resists it. He does not embrace power simply because it is available to him.
He does not claim authority because he has the right to. Instead, he repeatedly steps away from positions that others would consider inevitable. This refusal is not weakness, it is a deliberate act. In doing so, Jon challenges one of the most fundamental beliefs of his world, that destiny must be accepted, that power must be taken when it is offered. His life suggests something else, that choice matters more than fate, that identity is not something imposed, but something shaped through action, and that even those who are born into greatness can choose a quieter path. This becomes one of the most enduring philosophical elements of his legacy. Legacy in other characters, the quiet influence, Jon's impact is perhaps most clearly seen not in the structures he changes, but in the people he touches. His relationships do not transform others instantly.
Instead, they shift perspectives slowly, often in ways that are not immediately visible. Take Arya Stark. Their connection is built on mutual understanding. Both exist on the edges of identity, never fully fitting into the roles assigned to them. Through Jon, Arya sees a form of acceptance that does not demand conformity, and in return, Jon carries with him a reminder of innocence, of a world before conflict defined everything. This mutual influence shapes both of them, even as their paths diverge. Or consider Samwell Tarly. Sam's growth is closely tied to Jon's belief in him. Where others see weakness, Jon sees potential. He offers trust before it is earned, confidence before it is proven, and in doing so, he allows Sam to become something more than what the world expected. This is a recurring pattern in Jon's relationships. He sees people not as they are defined, but as they could be, and that vision changes them.
Even figures like Daenerys Targaryen are affected by his presence, though in more complex ways. Their connection highlights one of the central tensions in Jon's legacy, the balance between loyalty and morality. He is capable of deep allegiance, yet he is not blind to consequence. When those two forces come into conflict, his choices reflect not certainty, but painful clarity. And it is in those moments that his influence becomes most visible. Not because he convinces others to follow him, but because he forces them and the world to confront difficult truths. Conflict as meaning, not just struggle. Jon Snow's life is filled with conflict, but what distinguishes his legacy is how those conflicts are understood. They are not simply obstacles to overcome, nor battles to be won. Instead, they are moments of definition. Each conflict reveals something deeper, not just about the world, but about Jon himself.
His struggles are often internal as much as external. The tension between duty and desire, between belonging and independence, between loyalty and justice. These are not resolved easily. In many cases, they are not resolved at all. And yet, that is precisely what gives his legacy its depth. He does not offer simple answers. He does not represent certainty. Instead, he embodies the complexity of choice. In a world that often reduces morality to power, Jon's life reintroduces ambiguity, and with it, a more human understanding of what it means to act. The meaning of his journey. At its core, Jon Snow's journey is not about becoming something. It is about remaining something. Remaining compassionate in a world that rewards cruelty. Remaining thoughtful in a world driven by impulse. Remaining principled in a world where principles are often abandoned.
This constancy is not easy. It isolates him. It places him in conflict with those around him. It forces him to make decisions that carry immense personal cost, and yet he does not abandon it. This is where the true meaning of his journey lies, not in the roles he occupies, but in the values he refuses to surrender. He represents the idea that strength is not defined by dominance, but by endurance. Endurance of belief, of empathy, of responsibility. And this idea, though quiet, is powerful, because it suggests that even in a world shaped by chaos, there is still room for integrity. Long-term consequences, a world slightly changed. Jon does not reshape the world entirely. The structures of power remain. The cycles of conflict do not disappear completely. The world of Westeros continues, as it always has, with its complexities and contradictions. But it is not unchanged.
There is a subtle shift, a softening of certain divisions, a recognition, however faint, that the old ways are not the only ways. This is the nature of his legacy. It is not absolute. It does not erase the past, but it opens a door, and sometimes that is enough. How he is remembered. Jon Snow is not remembered in a single way. For some, he is a leader. For others, a traitor. For some, a hero. For others, a man who walked away. This ambiguity is fitting, because Jon himself never fully fits into a single definition. And perhaps that is the final piece of his legacy. He resists simplification. He cannot be reduced to a single role, a single action, or a single meaning. Instead, he remains what he always was, a person navigating a difficult world, making imperfect choices with the best understanding he has. And in that, there is something deeply human. The echo that remains after departure. There's a particular kind of legacy that does not stay where it was created. It travels. It moves quietly through memory, through behavior, through the choices of others who may not even realize they are carrying it forward. The life of Jon Snow leaves behind this kind of echo, one that does not rely on presence, but on influence. And perhaps the most telling part of his legacy is not what he built, but what continued after he stepped away. Because unlike many figures in the world of Game of Thrones, Jon does not remain at the center of power. He does not hold on to authority, nor does he attempt to shape the future directly once his part in it is complete. Instead, he withdraws, and in that withdrawal, something unusual happens. The world continues to change, yet traces of him remain within those changes.
The legacy of letting go. In a world where nearly every figure clings to control, Jon's decision to step away becomes one of his most defining acts. It is easy to see leadership as something that must be maintained. To hold power is to protect it. To achieve influence is to extend it. But Jon's life quietly challenges that assumption. By choosing to leave rather than remain, he introduces a different kind of conclusion, one where legacy is not tied to permanence. This act reshapes the meaning of success within his world, because if power is not the final goal, then something else must be. And in Jon's case, that something else appears to be peace, not only for himself, but for the fragile balance of the world around him. There is a quiet understanding in his departure that his continued presence might create new tensions.
That his identity, once revealed, might become a source of division rather than unity. And so, rather than allow himself to become another point of conflict, he removes himself from the center. This is not surrender, it is restraint.
and restraint in a world like his becomes a form of strength rarely recognized. The memory of a different kind of man. Over time, the memory of Jon Snow does not settle into a single narrative. Instead, it fragments. Different people remember him in different ways, shaped by their own experiences and beliefs. To some, he is the man who broke tradition. To others, the man who honored it in ways they did not understand. To some, he represents hope. To others, uncertainty. This multiplicity is important because it prevents his legacy from becoming rigid. It allows it to remain alive, open to interpretation, open to reflection.
And within that openness, his influence continues, not as a fixed idea, but as a question. What does it mean to lead without seeking power? What does it mean to act without certainty? What does it mean to choose responsibility over recognition? These questions do not have simple answers, but they persist. And in that persistence, Jon's legacy finds its endurance. The quiet transformation of values. While the world of Westeros does not transform overnight, subtle changes begin to take root. They are not always visible. They do not always appear in grand gestures or dramatic shifts, but they exist. In the way alliances are reconsidered, in the way enemies are sometimes understood rather than immediately opposed, in the way leadership is occasionally approached with caution rather than ambition. These are small changes, but they matter because they represent a movement away from absolute thinking.
And Jon's life, more than anything else, challenges absolutes. He lives in the space between extremes, between honor and necessity, between loyalty and justice, between belonging and independence. And by doing so, he creates a model that others, even unknowingly, begin to follow. The burden of being remembered. There is also a weight to Jon's legacy. Not all of it is light. For those who knew him closely, his absence is not just a symbol, it is a loss. His choices, though often necessary, leave behind consequences that cannot be undone. Relationships altered, trust reshaped, histories rewritten. This is an important part of his legacy as well, because it reminds us that even the most thoughtful decisions carry cost. Jon does not escape this reality. In fact, he embodies it. His life becomes a reflection of the idea that doing what is right does not always lead to peace. Sometimes it leads to solitude.
And yet, that solitude is not empty. It is filled with meaning, earned through sacrifice, through reflection, through the quiet acceptance of consequence. A legacy without finality. Perhaps the most unique aspect of Jon Snow's legacy is that it does not feel complete. It does not resolve into a clear ending. There is no final statement that defines him entirely. And this lack of finality is, in itself, meaningful, because it mirrors the nature of life within his world. Uncertain, ongoing, unfinished. Jon's story does not close with a sense of completion, but with a sense of continuation. Not his continuation within the structures of power, but the continuation of the ideas he carried, the belief that identity is chosen, the understanding that leadership is responsibility, the acceptance that moral clarity is often complicated. These ideas do not end with him.
They extend outward, shaping the world in ways that may never be fully visible. The meaning beneath the silence. If one were to search for a single meaning within Jon Snow's journey, it would not be found in any single action or decision. It would be found in the pattern of those actions, in the consistency of his choices, in the way he navigates uncertainty without surrendering to it. He represents the possibility of integrity within complexity, not perfect integrity, not unchanging certainty, but a persistent effort to act with awareness, with care, with consideration. This is not a dramatic legacy. It does not announce itself, but it endures because it speaks to something fundamental, that even in a world shaped by conflict, individuals can still choose how they respond, and that choice, repeated over time, becomes something larger than any single moment.
The legacy that lives beyond recognition. There is a final dimension to the life of Jon Snow that reveals itself only with distance. It is not found in what he achieved, nor in what others say about him, but in what no longer needs to be said. Because the deepest legacies are often the quietest ones. They do not depend on remembrance. They do not require acknowledgement. They continue even when forgotten. And Jon's life, in its quiet consistency, becomes exactly that kind of presence. The absence that teaches. After he leaves the center of the world, something subtle begins to unfold. There is no guiding voice, no figure standing between opposing forces, no one quietly absorbing the burden of impossible choices. And in that absence, others are forced to confront something unfamiliar, responsibility without guidance.
For many, Jon had been a kind of balance, someone who carried uncertainty without collapsing under it, someone who made decisions not because they were clear, but because they were necessary. Without him, that burden does not disappear, it spreads, and in that spreading, his legacy becomes shared. Others begin to face the same questions he once carried alone. What is worth protecting? What must be sacrificed? When does loyalty end and responsibility begin? These questions do not arrive with answers, but they arrive nonetheless. And in facing them, others begin to understand, not through instruction, but through experience, what Jon's life had always represented: the human shape of heroism. In many stories, heroism is defined by clarity, by decisive action, by visible triumph. But Jon Snow's life offers something different, a form of heroism that is uncertain, that hesitates, that questions itself. This does not make it weaker.
It makes it more human, because real choices are rarely simple. They are layered with doubt, with conflicting values, with consequences that cannot be fully known in advance. Jon embodies this complexity. He does not move forward with absolute confidence. He moves forward despite uncertainty.
and in doing so, he redefines what it means to be strong. Strength, in his case, is not the absence of doubt. It is the willingness to act while carrying it. This idea, once introduced into the world, does not disappear. It reshapes expectations. It allows others to see that hesitation is not failure, that reflection is not weakness, that choosing carefully is in itself a form of courage. The legacy of unfinished identity. One of the most enduring aspects of Jon's life is that his identity is never fully resolved. Even after his heritage is revealed, even after his role in the world becomes clear, there remains a sense of incompleteness.
He does not fully belong to any one place, not entirely of the North, not entirely of the South, not fully defined by his name, nor by the absence of it. And yet, this lack of resolution becomes a kind of freedom, because it allows him to move between worlds, to understand perspectives that others cannot, to exist in spaces where rigid identities would create barriers. This becomes part of his legacy as well. The idea that identity does not need to be fixed to be meaningful, that belonging can exist without permanence, that a person can be shaped by many influences without being confined by any single one. In a world that often demands clear definitions, this is a quiet but powerful shift. The gentle persistence of compassion. Perhaps the most subtle and most important aspect of Jon Snow's legacy is his unwavering compassion.
Not as an abstract ideal, but as a practical force. Again and again, he chooses to see others as more than their roles. He recognizes fear beneath aggression, pain beneath hostility, humanity beneath difference. This does not mean he avoids conflict. It means he approaches it differently, with awareness, with restraint, with an understanding that even necessary actions carry weight. Over time, this perspective begins to ripple outward, not always dramatically, not always immediately, but persistently, because once compassion is demonstrated in a world that expects cruelty, it becomes difficult to ignore. It plants a question: what if there is another way? And even if that question is not always answered, it remains, waiting. A world that remembers without knowing. As years pass, the memory of Jon Snow becomes less precise. Details fade, stories shift, interpretations change, and yet something remains, not the exact events.
Not the full truth of his life, but the feeling of it. A sense that there once was someone who acted differently, someone who chose with care, someone who carried burdens quietly. This kind of memory is difficult to define. It is not history in the formal sense. It is not legend in the traditional sense. It is something in between, a presence. And that presence continues to influence, even when its origin is no longer fully understood. The meaning that cannot be concluded. If one seeks a final meaning in Jon Snow's life, it cannot be found in a single statement, because his legacy resists conclusion. It is not a lesson to be summarized, not a message to be simplified. It is an experience, a pattern of choices, a way of moving through the world. And like all such things, It must be felt rather than defined.
This is why his story does not end in clarity, because clarity would limit it. Instead, it remains open, allowing each person who encounters it to find something different, a reflection of their own questions, their own uncertainties, their own search for meaning. The silence that carries meaning forward. There comes a point where a life no longer needs to speak to be understood. The story of Jon Snow reaches that point not through resolution, but through stillness. Not through a final act that defines everything, but through a gradual quieting, where meaning settles, not in events, but in their lasting impressions. Because some legacies do not grow louder over time. They become quieter, and in that quiet, they deepen. The space between what was and what could be. Jon's life exists in a space that few are willing to inhabit. A space between certainty and doubt, between belonging and distance, between action and reflection. Most people move toward one side or the other. They seek clarity, alignment, identity. They anchor themselves in something stable. But Jon never fully does, and this becomes one of the most important aspects of what he leaves behind. He shows that meaning does not always come from resolution. Sometimes it comes from remaining within the question, from allowing uncertainty to exist without rushing to eliminate it. In a world that often demands immediate answers, this is a quiet form of resistance, and over time, it becomes a subtle guide, not telling others what to think, but showing them how to remain present within complexity. The weight of choices that cannot be undone. Every meaningful life leaves behind decisions that cannot be reversed. Jon's is no different. There are moments in his life where the cost of action is clear, yet unavoidable. Moments where choosing one path means closing off another forever. And what defines his legacy is not that he avoids these moments, but that he accepts them. He does not pretend that difficult choices are clean. He does not attempt to escape their consequences. Instead, he carries them, quietly, fully. This willingness to bear the weight of irreversible decisions becomes one of the most enduring lessons he leaves behind, because it acknowledges something essential, that responsibility does not end with action. It continues long after. And that continuation, often unseen, is where true strength resides. The gentle reframing of strength. Strength, in the world Jon inhabits, is often defined through dominance, through victory, through the ability to impose one's will on others. But Jon's life offers another interpretation, one where strength is found in restraint, in patience, in the ability to pause even when urgency demands movement. This is not an obvious kind of strength.
It does not draw attention. It does not inspire immediate admiration. But over time, it reshapes how others understand power. Because when someone consistently chooses not to dominate, not to escalate, not to act out of impulse, it creates a new possibility. that power can exist without control, that influence can exist without force, and that presence alone can alter the direction of events. This idea, once introduced, becomes difficult to forget, even if it is not always followed. The legacy that refuses to become myth. Many figures, over time, are simplified, their lives reduced to symbols, their choices turned into clear narratives, their complexities smoothed into something easier to remember. But Jon Snow resists this transformation. His story does not settle into myth easily, because it contains too many contradictions, too many uncertainties, too many moments that cannot be neatly categorized. And this resistance becomes part of his legacy.
He remains human, not elevated beyond recognition, not stripped of ambiguity, but preserved in a way that allows future generations to see not just what he did, but how he struggled. This is important because it keeps his legacy accessible, not as something to admire from a distance, but as something to engage with directly. The continuation of quiet influence. Even without presence, even without recognition, Jon's influence continues in subtle ways, in the hesitation before conflict, in the reconsideration of inherited beliefs, in the willingness to listen, even when disagreement feels easier. These moments are small. They do not reshape the world immediately, but they accumulate, and over time, accumulation becomes change. This is the nature of quiet influence. It does not demand attention. It does not announce itself, but it persists. And persistence, more than intensity, is what allows it to endure.
The meaning that remains unspoken. There is something about Jon Snow's life that resists full articulation, not because it lacks meaning, but because its meaning cannot be confined to words. It exists in patterns, in repeated choices, in the consistency of a certain way of being. And this makes it difficult to summarize, because it is not a single idea. It is a lived experience, one that must be understood gradually, through reflection, through observation, through time. And perhaps that is why his legacy feels different, because it does not tell, it suggests, it invites, it leaves space. A final, restful reflection. And so, as the world continues, unchanged in some ways, quietly altered in others, the trace of Jon Snow remains, not as a figure to be followed,
Not as a story to be repeated, but as a presence, a reminder that within even the most uncertain paths, there can exist a quiet consistency, a way of moving forward that does not rely on certainty, but on care, a way of choosing that does not eliminate doubt, but carries it with intention. This is not a loud legacy. It does not reshape the world all at once, but it lingers in the stillness between decisions, in the moments where action is weighed rather than rushed, in the quiet understanding that doing what is right is not always clear, but is always worth attempting. And in that understanding, gentle and incomplete, his story continues, not in what is remembered, but in what is quietly lived, again and again, long after he is gone.